Jake Thornton woke up that morning the same way he had for the past 3 years on New Montana. Cold, tired, and wondering how much longer he could keep his ranch running before the bank finally took it from him. The colony world's second sun hadn't risen yet, leaving everything covered in a thick layer of frost that crunched under his worn boots as he made his way to the stable. His breath came out in white puffs. The temperature had dropped overnight, which wasn't unusual, but something felt off. He'd been ranching long enough to trust his gut, and right now his gut was telling him something was wrong. The cattle proved him right. Normally they'd be crowding near the stable entrance, eager for their morning feed. Instead, they were packed against the far fence line as far from the stable as they could get. Their eyes were wide, nostrils flaring. Whatever spooked them had them terrified. Jake's hand went to the plasma pistol on his hip. New Montana wasn't Earth. The wildlife here could kill a man in seconds if he wasn't careful. He'd lost a neighbor to a rock lizard just last month. The stable door hung slightly open, swinging in the cold wind. He definitely remembered closing it the night before. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The smell hit him first. Blood. Fresh and metallic. Then he saw the shape in the corner and his heart sank. The creature was massive, easily the size of his biggest horse. But it wasn't anything he'd ever seen in the colony's wildlife database. Its body was covered in scales that caught the dim light, shimmering with colors that seemed to shift even though the creature was completely still. Wings, folded and torn, spread out across the hay. Something had gotten to its throat. The wound was brutal. This thing had died fighting. Then Jake heard it. A soft chirping sound, almost like birds but deeper, more musical. He turned slowly and found them huddled in the opposite corner. 4 small creatures, barely bigger than the barn cats he used to have back on Earth. They were watching him with eyes that seemed too large for their heads, too aware, too intelligent. The little ones had the same shimmering scales as the big one, but theirs shifted colors constantly. Purple melted into blue, then flashed to green when he took a step closer. Their wings were translucent, glowing faintly in the darkness like paper lanterns. They trembled as they huddled together, clearly terrified but too weak to run. Jake knew what he should do. New Montana had laws about this. Strict laws. Any alien fauna had to be reported immediately, especially unknown species. The penalties for hiding unregistered creatures were severe. He could lose everything. But when the smallest one looked up at him, making a sound that was unmistakably a whimper, he found he couldn't move toward his communicator. These weren't monsters. They were babies. Orphaned babies who just watched their mother die. Jake made his decision. He backed away slowly, grabbed one of the protein supplement packs he kept for sick cattle and tore it open. The stuff was expensive, specially formulated nutrition that cost him more than his own meals most days. He scattered it on the ground between them and stepped back. The largest of the 4 moved first. It was braver than the others or maybe just hungrier. It crept forward, scales shifting to a cautious orange color, and sniffed the food. Then it ate. Quickly. Desperately. The others followed, and Jake watched their scales gradually brighten as they devoured every last bit of the supplement. When they finished, the big one looked at him again. Its scales turned a warm rust color, and it made a sound that was definitely different from before. Softer. Almost like a purr mixed with a musical note. The sound made something in Jake's chest tighten. He'd heard gratitude before in his life, from people he'd helped, from animals he'd saved. This was that. This tiny alien creature was thanking him. Jake ran a hand over his face. He was in trouble now. Deep trouble. But looking at these 4 small lives, thinking about what would happen if he turned them over to the authorities, he knew he couldn't do it. The colony would ship them off-world. To labs. To research facilities. They'd spend their lives in cages, poked and studied until they either died or went insane. He thought about their mother, dying alone in his stable, probably just trying to find somewhere safe for her babies. She'd failed, but maybe he didn't have to. All right then, Jake said quietly, more to himself than to them. Guess you're staying for now. But you better not eat my cattle. The largest one chirped again, and Jake could have sworn it sounded like agreement. He was probably imagining things. Either way, he had 4 new mouths to feed and about 1,000 ways this could go wrong. But for the first time in months, standing in his cold stable with 4 impossible creatures staring at him with trusting eyes, Jake Thornton felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. 3 weeks had changed everything. Jake found himself waking up earlier each morning not because he had to, but because he actually wanted to check on them. The 4 little creatures had become part of his daily routine in a way he hadn't expected. Every credit he had left went into those expensive protein supplements, and he'd started skipping his own meals just to make sure they had enough. The eldest one had started showing her rust-colored scales more often than the others, so Jake started calling her Ember. It felt right somehow. The others got names too. Ruby for the one with deep red tones, Ash for the gray and silver one, and Spark for the smallest, whose scales seemed to flicker like tiny flames when she got excited. But it was Ember who amazed him most. She was smart. Really smart. Not just animal smart like his cattle or the few dogs he'd seen on the colony. She understood him. When he talked to her, she'd tilt her head and watch his mouth, like she was studying how he made the sounds. Within a week, she'd figured out that certain words meant certain things. Food made her scales brighten. Stay made her stop whatever she was doing. Good girl made her chirp that musical sound that meant she was happy. The others followed her lead in everything. If Ember trusted Jake, they trusted him. He felt safe, they felt safe. She was their leader now that their mother was gone, even though she couldn't have been more than a few months old herself. Jake kept them hidden in the stable, only letting them out at night when the other ranchers were asleep. He'd buried their mother deep in the back pasture, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. Seemed like the right thing to do. Sometimes he'd catch Ember staring in that direction, her scales turning a sad shade of blue. Then came the morning that changed everything. Jake was trying to move his cattle from the east pasture to the west one for fresh grazing. It was a job he hated. The cattle were stubborn, and herding them alone usually meant an hour of running back and forth, shouting himself hoarse, and watching half of them wander off in the wrong direction anyway. He was already sweating despite the cold morning air when Ember slipped out of the stable. He'd told her to stay. He always did when he worked outside. But she'd apparently decided she was done listening to that particular command. She walked right past him, calm as could be, and positioned herself at the far edge of the herd. Jake was about to call her back when something incredible happened. Ember's scales began to glow, starting from her spine and spreading outward. He could feel the heat from where he stood, a gentle warmth that pulsed in waves. The cattle felt it too. They turned toward her, not spooked but curious, and started moving. Not running. Not scattering. Just walking steadily in the exact direction Jake needed them to go. She was herding them. Using heat instead of noise or force. The cattle responded to it like they would to sunshine on a cold day, naturally drawn to the warmth. When they started to drift too far to the left, Ember moved and pulsed the heat again, correcting their direction. It was like watching a master at work. 15 minutes. That's all it took. A job that normally left him exhausted and frustrated was done in 15 minutes, and the cattle were exactly where he needed them. Jake stood there staring at Ember, who looked quite pleased with herself. Her scales had shifted to a bright, proud gold. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "You're something else, aren't you?" But his amazement was short-lived. That afternoon he spotted the official vehicle coming up his long driveway. Deputy Marshal Kate Rivers. His stomach dropped. Kate was fair but strict, and she took the colony laws seriously. She stepped out of her vehicle, adjusting her hat against the wind. "Afternoon, Jake." "Kate." He kept his voice steady, casual. "What brings you out here?" "Colony office picked up some unusual heat signatures from your property over the past few weeks. Thermal scans showed patterns that don't match any registered equipment or known wildlife." Her eyes scanned the property. "You seen anything strange around here?" Jake forced a laugh. "You mean besides my heating system trying to kill me? That old piece of junk has been acting up something fierce. Probably what your scans picked up." Kate studied him for a long moment. She'd known him for 2 years now, ever since he'd moved to New Montana. They'd shared drinks at the colony bar, helped each other with repairs. She was a friend. But she was also law enforcement. "Jake, I'm going to be straight with you. Registration deadline for any xenofauna is next week. Anything not registered with the colony gets relocated. You understand what that means, right?" "I understand." "Good." She walked back to her vehicle but paused before getting in. "Jake, if there's something you need to tell me, now would be the time. I'd rather hear it from you than find out some other way." "Nothing to tell, Kate. Just me and my cattle out here." After she drove away, Jake sat on his porch steps, his head in his hands. They knew. Maybe not exactly what, but they knew something was here. He had 1 week before they'd come with scanners and search teams. He felt something touch his hand. Ember had crept out of the stable, staying low to the ground. She placed her small clawed foot on his palm, gentle despite the sharp points. Her scales began to flicker through colors. Blue, gold, red, purple. Faster and faster until they blurred together. Then Jake saw it. Not with his eyes, but somehow directly in his mind. Images flooding his consciousness. A world dying, its star burning too bright. Ships launching into space, desperate and overloaded. Ember's mother, carrying her children through the darkness, searching for anywhere that might be safe. Anywhere that might welcome them. Landing on New Montana in the dead of night. Finding his stable. Thinking, hoping that maybe here they could survive. They weren't invaders. They weren't dangerous animals. They were refugees. Running from death, hoping to find life. Jake's throat tightened. He looked at Ember, at her intelligent eyes watching him so carefully. She was asking him. Not with words but with everything she had. Asking if he'd protect them. Asking if they could trust him. "I won't let them take you," Jake said quietly. His voice was firm despite the fear in his gut. "I promise you that. We'll figure this out." Ember's scales shifted to that warm rust color again, and she made her chirping sound. The others emerged from the stable, gathering around him. Ruby. Little Spark. All of them looking at him with trust he wasn't sure he deserved. But he'd given his word. And Jake Thornton never broke a promise. They showed up 5 days after Kate's visit. 3 vehicles, all shiny and new, the kind that cost more than Jake's entire ranch. He was fixing a fence post when he saw them coming up the drive, kicking up dust in perfect formation. His stomach turned. This wasn't a friendly visit. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle wore a suit that had probably never seen dirt in its life. His shoes gleamed in the sunlight. Everything about him screamed money and power, 2 things Jake had never had much of. The man's smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those were cold. Calculating. "Mr. Thornton?" The man didn't wait for an answer. "Rick Dawson, Helios Mining Corporation. Mind if we have a chat?" Jake wiped his hands on his jeans. "Depends on what you want to chat about." Rick gestured to the other men, who started unpacking scanning equipment from their vehicles. Professional. Efficient. They'd done this before. "We've been doing geological surveys of this region. Very thorough surveys. Your property came up in our results." They walked toward the house, Rick talking the whole way. His voice was smooth, practiced. The kind of voice that had convinced 1,000 people to sign papers they'd later regret. Jake recognized it because he'd heard it before, back on Earth, when the banks had come for his family's farm. Inside the kitchen, Rick pulled out a tablet and slapped a contract down on Jake's worn table. The numbers on it made Jake's eyes widen despite himself. Triple market value. More money than he'd see in 10 years of ranching. "Your land sits on worthless bedrock, Mr. Thornton. Nothing but rock and dirt for miles down. You're barely scraping by out here. This offer is generous. More than generous." Rick's finger tapped the screen. "Sign this, relocate somewhere more profitable, and you'll actually have a future." Jake stared at the contract. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't tempted. His bank account was almost empty. He'd been eating protein rations for weeks to afford food for Ember and the others. The ranch was failing, had been failing since he got here. This money could change everything. "Not interested," he heard himself say. Rick's smile disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. The friendly businessman vanished, replaced by something harder. Meaner. "That's disappointing. Especially since we've detected some irregularities on your property." Irregularities. Jake kept his voice flat. "Unregistered xenofauna. Our scans picked up heat signatures that don't match any known species in the colony database. Bioluminescent readings too. Very unusual." Rick leaned back in his chair, studying Jake like a bug under glass. Now, harboring unregistered alien life carries some serious penalties. Heavy fines. Possible jail time. The colony takes this very seriously. Jake's hands curled into fists under the table. "I don't know what your scans picked up. Don't play stupid, Mr. Thornton. It doesn't suit you." Rick pulled up more data on his tablet. "Here's what I think happened. Some creatures wandered onto your property. You felt sorry for them. Maybe you're feeding them. Maybe you've gotten attached. But you're breaking the law. That makes things complicated for you. Unless what? Unless you cooperate. Turn over the creatures to us. They'll be well cared for, studied properly. You sign this contract, sell us the land, and we make all those legal problems disappear. You walk away clean with enough money to start over somewhere that isn't a frozen wasteland." Rick's smile returned, sharp as a knife. "Everyone wins." Jake stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Get off my property. Now." Rick stood too, smoothing his suit. "You're making a mistake. A big one. We'll be back with colony authorities and proper search warrants. And when we find what we know is here, you'll lose everything. The creatures. The land. Your freedom. Think about that." Jake watched them drive away, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. from rage. These corporate vultures thought they could just swoop in and take everything. They thought he'd roll over because he was poor and desperate. That night, Jake sat in the stable with Ember. The others were sleeping in their nest, but Ember always seemed to know when he was upset. She sat beside him, her scales glowing softly in the darkness, providing gentle warmth against the cold. "They know about you," Jake said quietly. "All of you. And I don't know how to fight them. I've got no money for lawyers. No political connections. Nothing." He rubbed his face, exhausted. "Maybe you'd be better off if I'd never found you." Ember made a sound. Not her usual chirp, but something deeper. More urgent. She stood and walked to the stable wall, the old wooden boards that Jake had been meaning to replace for months. She pressed her claws against it and suddenly her scales began to glow. Not just a little. Bright enough that Jake had to squint. The glow spread from her body into the ground itself, pulsing like a heartbeat. Jake felt it through his boots. A vibration. A rhythm. And then the images came, flooding his mind like a dam breaking. He saw underground. Through solid rock and layers of soil. Saw vast rivers flowing beneath his feet. Pure water. Clean water. Enough to supply the entire colony for years. He saw mineral deposits scattered through the rock. Rare elements the colony needed for technology, for medicine, for survival. He saw his land, this supposedly worthless patch of frozen dirt, as what it really was. The colony's future. Ember released the wall and looked at him. Her eyes were intense, urgent. She'd shown him what her species could do. What she'd sensed from the moment they'd arrived here. The land wasn't worthless. It was priceless. And Helios Mining Corporation knew it. That's why they wanted him gone. They didn't want to strip mine worthless rock. They wanted to steal everything beneath his feet and sell it back to the colony at premium prices. Rick Dawson had lied to his face. Jake looked at Ember, this incredible creature who'd just handed him the only weapon he had against corporate greed. "You just saved us, didn't you?" Ember's scales shifted to gold and she chirped softly. But Jake could see the worry in her eyes. Knowing the truth was one thing. Proving it was another. And they were running out of time. The breaking point. Jake knew he had to do something fast. He gathered all his research, every single piece of evidence he'd collected over the months. The strange patterns in the dragon's behavior, the way they responded to the native soil, how their scales changed color depending on what minerals they consumed. He had notebooks filled with observations, photos of the dragons thriving compared to the sickly creatures in corporate facilities. Everything pointed to one truth: these magnificent beings needed their natural environment to survive. He went straight to the colony council, hoping someone would listen. The meeting room was packed with the settlement's leaders, people who'd helped build this community from nothing. Jake laid out everything he'd discovered. He showed them videos of Ember and her family, healthy and strong when allowed to forage naturally. He presented data comparing their growth rates to the corporate dragons who were kept in controlled environments. But something felt wrong from the start. The council members barely looked at his evidence. They exchanged glances with each other, small smirks appearing on some faces. Jake's stomach dropped when he realized what had happened. Helios Corporation hadn't just been buying land. They'd been buying influence, buying people. The council chair cut him off mid-presentation. They called his research unscientific, claimed he was too emotionally attached to make objective observations. One council member actually laughed, saying Jake had spent too much time alone with animals and was starting to lose touch with reality. They dismissed everything without really examining it. The meeting was over in less than 20 minutes. Jake walked back to his ranch feeling defeated. Years of work, months of careful observation, all thrown away because corporate money spoke louder than truth. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when Ember and her family depended on him. Then everything changed in the worst possible way. A few days after that disastrous council meeting, Jake noticed something terribly wrong. Spark, the youngest dragon, the playful one who always greeted him with enthusiastic chirps, was moving slowly. Her usual bright copper scales, which normally shimmered like a new penny in the sunlight, were turning dull and gray. It happened so fast it scared him. He tried everything he could think of. He offered her favorite foods, the protein-rich insects she usually devoured. Nothing. He brought her to the warmest spot on the ranch where she loved to nap. She just lay there barely moving. Her eyes, once bright and curious, looked dim and unfocused. Jake called Doc Melissa Turner, the colony's veterinarian. She'd worked with Earth animals her whole career, but she'd been studying the imported alien species too. She was one of the few professionals Jake still trusted, someone who hadn't sold out to corporate interests. Melissa arrived within an hour. Jake watched anxiously as she examined Spark, checking her vital signs, looking at her scales under magnification, taking blood samples. The examination seemed to take forever. Finally, Melissa sat back and pulled off her gloves. The look on her face told Jake everything before she even spoke. "It's genetic degradation," she said quietly. "I've been reading about this in other transplanted species across the colony worlds. When creatures are taken too far from their evolutionary environment, sometimes their bodies just start breaking down at the cellular level." Jake felt his world crumbling. "There has to be something we can do. Medicine, supplements, something." Melissa shook her head slowly. "She needs specific minerals from her homeworld, Jake. Her body is literally forgetting how to function without them. The mineral composition here is close, but not close enough. Without the exact elements she evolved with." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. After Melissa left, Jake sat alone in the stable. The evening sun cast long shadows through the wooden slats. Dust particles danced in the light beams. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching his life from outside his body. His old pistol sat heavy in his hand. He'd carried that gun for 20 years, through bandit raids and predator attacks. It had protected his livelihood, kept him alive on this frontier world. Now it felt like a burden, a terrible responsibility he never wanted. He couldn't let Spark suffer. Watching her slow decline, seeing the pain in her dimming eyes, it would be cruel to let it continue. On the frontier, sometimes mercy meant making the hardest choice. He'd done it before with injured livestock, animals too far gone to save. But this felt different. Spark wasn't just livestock. She was family. Jake sat there for what felt like hours, trying to gather the courage to do what seemed necessary. His hands trembled. Tears he'd been holding back finally started falling. This wasn't fair. None of this was fair. These creatures had been ripped from their world through no choice of their own, and now they were paying the price. That's when Ember appeared in the stable doorway. She must have sensed something was wrong. Dragons were incredibly perceptive, picking up on emotional states in ways Jake still didn't fully understand. Her scales were flashing colors he'd never seen before, desperate reds mixed with pleading golds, patterns that seemed to pulse with urgency. She moved quickly, positioning herself directly between Jake and Spark. Her wings spread wide, creating a barrier. It was a protective stance, a mother defending her child. But there was something more in her body language, something that made Jake's breath catch. Ember looked directly into his eyes. He saw intelligence there, deep and profound. Not animal cunning, but real understanding. She knew exactly what he'd been planning, and she was begging him not to. Then the impossible happened. Ember's throat worked, muscles straining in ways they weren't designed for. Her whole body tensed with effort. And she spoke. Please." The word came out mangled, painful sounding. But it was clear. It was human speech. Jake dropped the gun. It clattered on the stable floor. Ember continued, each word obviously causing her discomfort, her vocal cords struggling to form sounds they'd never evolved to make. "Please, live." She'd been listening to him all these months. Every word he'd spoken while working around the ranch, every conversation, every command. She'd been learning, understanding, preparing for this exact moment. Ember lowered her massive head all the way to the ground. It was a gesture of complete submission, something dragons only did when acknowledging total defeat. Her scales began cycling through every color Jake had ever seen and some he hadn't. It was like watching her entire soul pour out through her skin. He understood what she was showing him. He saw their potential, everything they could become. He saw their strength, their intelligence, their ability to learn and adapt. He saw their loyalty, forged through months of kindness and respect. She was offering everything, their service, their abilities, their complete devotion. They would become whatever humanity needed them to be, work however hard they needed to work, sacrifice whatever they needed to sacrifice. If he would just save her family. If he would just give them a chance to live. Jake's hands were shaking so hard he could barely function. Something shifted inside him in that moment, something fundamental about how he saw the world. He'd spent his whole life on frontier worlds, places where strength meant survival and weakness meant death. He'd learned to be hard, to make tough choices, to do what was necessary. But standing there, looking at Ember's desperate plea, seeing a mother willing to give up everything for her children, Jake realized humanity had a different choice to make. They could be conquerors, taking what they wanted without thought for the cost. They could be exploiters, using other beings as tools and resources. Or they could be something better. They could be protectors. "Get up, Ember," Jake said softly. His voice was rough with emotion, but his resolve was iron strong. "We're going to save her. All of you. He didn't know how yet. He didn't have a plan. But he made a promise in that stable, and Jake always kept his promises. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do, he would find a way to save these dragons. Even if it meant going to war with Helios Corporation itself. Taking a stand. Jake knew he had one shot at this. One chance to make people see what he'd discovered, to show them what was really at stake. The Colony Council had already dismissed him, bought off by corporate money. Going through official channels again would be pointless. So he decided to go straight to the people. He set up his old camera equipment, the same gear he'd used years ago to document ranch life for folks back on Earth. His hands were steadier now than they'd been in the stable. He had purpose. He had truth on his side. And he had Ember's desperate plea still echoing in his mind. Jake started a live stream on the colony's public network. Anyone with a screen could tune in, and out here on the frontier, everyone was connected. It was how settlers stayed informed, how they maintained their sense of community across vast distances. Within minutes of going live, hundreds of viewers logged on. Then thousands. He positioned the camera so viewers could see Spark lying in the hay. The little dragon's breathing was shallow, her once brilliant scales now the color of old ash. It was heartbreaking to watch. Jake didn't hide anything. He wanted people to see the truth no matter how painful. Then he did something that would change everything. He called Ember over and asked her to speak again. She struggled with the words, her throat working hard to form human sounds. But she managed it. Please, help, family. The chat exploded. Thousands of messages flooded in simultaneously. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. An alien creature, speaking human language, begging for help. It shattered every assumption about these dragons being simple animals. Jake took a deep breath and began explaining everything he'd learned. He showed them his research, months of careful observations. He demonstrated how the dragons reacted to different soils, how their scales changed colors based on mineral content. He explained the patterns he'd noticed, the way they seemed healthiest when allowed to dig in certain areas of his property. Then came the big reveal. Jake pulled out geological surveys he'd conducted himself, maps and soil samples he'd been analyzing in secret. The dragons had been drawn to a specific area for a reason. Beneath his land lay a massive underground aquifer, rich with rare minerals. These weren't just any minerals, they were the exact compounds the dragons needed to survive. And there was something else. That same aquifer could provide clean water for the entire colony for decades. With New Montana's climate getting harsher each year, with droughts predicted to become more frequent and severe, this water source could mean the difference between the colony's success and failure. Jake's voice grew harder as he continued. Helios Corporation wants to strip mine this entire area. They've been buying up land, pushing out independent ranchers like me. They told the council they're looking for industrial metals. But that's not the whole truth. He pulled up documents Kate had helped him obtain, showing Helios's real plans. The corporation wanted to extract minerals fast and cheap, using methods that would contaminate the aquifer permanently. They'd make their profit and move on, leaving New Montana without its future water supply. These dragons showed me what was beneath us, Jake said, looking directly into the camera. They didn't mean to, they were just trying to survive, searching for what their bodies needed. But they gave us something precious anyway. Information that could save this colony. He gestured to Ember and her family standing together in the stable. They're not asking for charity. They're offering partnership. They can help us terraform this world. Their heat manipulation abilities could make frozen soil farmable. Their strength could help us build. Their intelligence, and yes, they are intelligent, you just heard one speak, could teach us things we never imagined. Jake paused, letting his words sink in. Across New Montana, thousands of colonists watched their screens in silence. In homes and workshops, in bars and community centers, people stopped what they were doing to listen. The question we have to answer tonight is simple, Jake continued. What kind of humans are we? Are we the kind who protect those who can't protect themselves? Are we the kind who recognize allies when we find them? Or are we the kind who throw away potential partnerships for quick corporate profit? He showed them the numbers. What Helios was offering the colony in mining fees versus what sustainable aquifer management could provide over decades. The math wasn't even close. Short-term thinking versus long-term prosperity. I'm not saying trust these creatures blindly, Jake added. I'm saying give them a chance. Give us a chance. Let's build something new here. Let's show the galaxy that humanity isn't just about taking what we want. We can be better than that. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The colony's communication network nearly crashed from the flood of messages. People weren't just watching anymore, they were organizing. Within an hour, thousands of colonists began gathering at the council chambers. They came from every corner of New Montana, leaving their farms and businesses and homes. They carried signs, they chanted slogans, they demanded to be heard. This wasn't a riot, it was democracy in action, frontier style. Kate was at the front of the crowd, megaphone in hand. She'd printed out every piece of evidence showing Helios had falsified their geological reports to the council. She'd found proof they'd hidden information about the aquifer, proof they'd bribed officials, proof they'd been planning to leave New Montana high and dry once they'd extracted what they wanted. The council had no choice but to call an emergency session. They tried to maintain order, but the chambers were packed with angry settlers who'd been lied to. Person after person stood up to speak. Farmers talked about water scarcity. Parents worried about their children's futures. Scientists presented data supporting Jake's findings. The vote happened just before midnight. It wasn't even close. 15-2 in favor of protecting Jake's land and granting legal sanctuary to the dragons. Helios Corporation's mining permits were revoked. New Montana would develop its water resources sustainably, and Jake's ranch became the colony's first official human-alien cooperative homestead. But the real work was just beginning. Spark was still sick, still dying. Having legal protection didn't magically cure genetic degradation. They needed those minerals and they needed them fast. Doc Melissa worked around the clock in her lab. She took samples from the aquifer and began the delicate process of isolating the exact mineral compounds Spark's body required. It wasn't simple chemistry, she was trying to replicate the biochemistry of an alien world. She failed dozens of times, each attempt bringing heartbreak. Finally, on the third day she succeeded. She synthesized a mineral supplement that matched what Spark needed. Jake administered it himself, mixing it into water and helping the little dragon drink. For hours nothing seemed to change. Jake sat with Spark through the night, watching, hoping, praying to whatever forces might be listening. Then, as dawn broke over New Montana, Spark stirred. Her scales, which had been that awful dead gray, began showing hints of color. Just touches at first, like someone had brushed gold paint across ash. But it spread, slowly at first, then faster. Within a day, her vibrant copper-gold coloring had returned completely. Within 2 days she was eating again. Within a week she was flying, chasing her siblings across the prairie, chirping with pure joy. Jake's ranch transformed. Word spread about what had happened, and other ranchers started visiting, wanting to learn. Jake taught them everything he knew about working with dragons. How to read their scale colors, how to communicate through gestures and tone, how to build trust gradually. The dragons responded beautifully. They seemed to understand they'd been given a second chance, a real home. They worked alongside humans with enthusiasm that seemed almost grateful. In the frozen northern plains, they used their heat manipulation to warm the soil, making it suitable for crops that had never grown on New Montana before. Agricultural yields increased by 40% in the first year alone. And then came the babies. The first clutch of dragon eggs laid on New Montana, proof that Ember's family was truly thriving now. When they hatched, tiny dragons emerged, no bigger than house cats, making high-pitched chirping sounds that melted hearts across the colony. The colony's children fell completely in love with them. Schools started programs where kids could learn about dragon care. Birthday parties featured baby dragon visits. A whole generation of New Montana's children grew up considering dragons as normal as horses or dogs. Years passed. Jake's hair turned completely gray, then white. His ranch expanded, became famous across the frontier territories. People came from other worlds to see the miracle of human-dragon cooperation, to learn how it worked, to take those lessons back to their own colonies. One afternoon, a journalist arrived from Earth itself. She traveled 6 months through space to interview Jake for a documentary about humanity's expansion into the stars. She set up her equipment on his porch, the same porch where he'd once sat planning to end Spark's suffering. Behind them, Ember was teaching a mixed class of young dragons and human children. She'd become remarkably good at it over the years, patient and gentle. The children adored her, climbing on her back during breaks, bringing her treats they'd made themselves. The journalist asked her questions, standard stuff about ranch operations and daily life. Then she asked the big one, the question she'd really come all this way to ask. Mr. Jake, you risked everything for alien creatures. Your livelihood, your reputation, potentially your freedom if Helios had pressed charges. Why did you do it? Jake was quiet for a long moment. He watched Ember with the children, watched tiny dragons learning to fly alongside human kids learning to ride. He thought about that night in the stable, about Ember's desperate plea, about the choice humanity faced. Finally he smiled. It was a peaceful smile, the expression of someone who'd found exactly what they were meant to do with their life. Because strength isn't about taking what you want, he said simply. Real strength is about making room for others who need it. It's about recognizing that the galaxy is big enough for all of us, that we're better together than apart. That's what makes us human, not our technology or our weapons or our ability to conquer. It's our capacity for compassion, for partnership, for choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. He gestured to the scene before them, dragons and humans working in harmony. This is what makes us worthy of the stars. Not because we can take them, but because we can share them. The documentary aired across human space 6 months later. New Montana became famous, not for its resources or its strategic location, but for what it represented. A new way forward. Proof that humanity's expansion into the galaxy didn't have to mean domination and exploitation. Other colonies started their own cooperative programs with native species. Laws changed. Attitudes shifted. The Helios Corporation model of quick extraction and profit began falling out of favor, replaced by sustainable development and genuine partnership with alien life. And it all started with one rancher, one dragon, and one simple choice: to show mercy instead of giving up. To protect instead of destroy. To build bridges instead of walls. That's humanity's real gift to the galaxy, not our strength but our heart. The end.